Welcome to Central Youth Network's monthly Spotlight webinar. This month, we will be focusing on trauma-informed youth ministry. There's no denying that our world has endured collective trauma over the past few years. Considering this shared trauma and situations of individual trauma, the church and those involved in ministry are in need of awareness, as well as tools and skills to accomplish effective ministry to those who have or are currently enduring trauma. Our very own Peggy McGee, who is trained and certified in trauma-informed care, is going to share some great wisdom with us today. But before we get started, I have a few technical details for you. So while this webinar is a one-way presentation, we want to encourage you to take advantage of the question and answer chat option. I invite you at this moment to introduce yourself in that chat and where you're from as well. There's an option to enter your name in the specific Q&A chat as well. We will have some Q&A moderators that will help answer some of your questions in the chat, but we will also be sure to answer some questions live with Peggy for you here as well. And lastly, if you are having technical difficulties, we will be sure to have a recording of this webinar available for you to view at a later time. All right, it's time to get started. Welcome, Peggy.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for having me back. I love doing the webinars. I don't know if I like being in front of the screen as much as I like being behind the screen, but it's great to be here. And I'm really excited for all of you that are interested in joining the conversation on trauma-informed care and resiliency and how we can help our youth and our families that have experienced trauma, but more importantly, how they can live and thrive, not just survive through traumatic events. So I always start every presentation to say I don't necessarily go into specific traumatic instances. So it is not my intention to have anything that would re-traumatize or cause any significant triggers for anybody in this group, but you know yourself best. And so I encourage you that as you listen through this, as you engage in your own experiences, that if there are things or if there are moments where you just need to take a step away, where you need to process, or maybe you need to pause and come back, feel free to do that. So again, as Katie said, we are going to record these. So if it is too much or if it just hits a little too close to home, be aware that you know yourself best and what you can handle. That's not the intention here. But I do want to talk just a little bit to you about trauma-informed care, my understanding and journey in learning about this and what we do with it started over a decade ago. I was working as a home visitor, and a home visitor is exactly what it sounds like. I was a parent educator and I got to go into the homes of people, and part of my training in that role was to be certified and then to continue my education in trauma-informed care, resilience building, discovering what can help our families. And so through that, what I've discovered is this isn't a one and done. I for sure have been continuing to learn. I read new books and get new information all the time. And so to do a trauma-informed care lunchtime webinar will be effective, but it will be in no way comprehensive. And so it's important to know. I have heard it said that to try to talk about trauma-informed care in less than an hour is like saying, I'm going to take you to Paris, but we're only having lunch at one restaurant. So you can say you went there, but you didn't get the full scope or understanding until you take some more time to really jump into that. And we'll talk a little bit more. Again, as we go through this, if you've got questions, please put those in the chat or the question and answer, and I'll try to get to those at the end of this presentation. So I'm going to jump in. I'm going to share my screen, which is always the most nerve-wracking part of anything that we do using the media. But hopefully you can all see that, and I'll get a message if you can't. But this is just kind of to help guide through things. And for those of you that are visual learners, it gives you a chance to see to visualize things. So we'll go ahead and get started here in conversations on trauma-informed care and resilience. So, all right, let's see if I can move on. I just want to start first with some facts about youth development. I think it's important to know that when we talk about trauma-informed care today, we're specifically talking about it. I'm going to talk specifics within the context of youth. And so when we are talking about something that will affect their development, it's important to have an understanding of how kids develop. So just some fun facts for those of you that are information lovers. So the first one is that the most rapid stage of development and growth is between the ages of 0 to 5. And so physically, mentally, socially, emotionally, those are developing at a rapid rate that will never be duplicated in the life of that child. So the development and growth between the ages of 0 to 5 is significant. And these are the ages that also they don't always have the language. We don't know what has happened to them. We don't know what they're experiencing or feeling. It's a little bit of a guessing game sometimes with this age group. But most kids in the 0 to 5 age develop the same way. So the interesting thing with this is we can have developmental mile markers. So we know that children by the age of 18 months should be doing certain things, or children when they enter into preschool should be doing certain things. So we can track the development of a child at this stage to see if they're on track, and we could get some interventions, or we can make some observations that if something is not tracking appropriately, that they need to have some interventions or supports at this time. The second most rapid or fastest rate of development and growth is the pre-adolescence, adolescence, youth 10 to 15. And so again, it is social, emotional, physical, mental, spiritual. They are just rapidly discovering the world and how they fit into it. The interesting thing about this one is that it ranges from a 6 to 8 year age difference. So this is why you could at any given time walk into a middle school classroom and you would see kids that look like they are 10 and kids that look like they are 15 in the same classroom. It's why you could have a group of kids and some of them are still doing things that you would assume grade schoolers would do, and some of them feel like they're 1 year away from being a full-grown adult. And so there is no tracking for this age group. So it is it's a very awkward stage. We've all been there, and it can be very difficult to navigate because sometimes the intellectual development hasn't caught up with the physical, or the social development hasn't caught up with the emotional development. And so it can be really difficult. And that's why we love people that work with middle schoolers and early high schoolers, because this is a very difficult age. But it is so important because they are growing and developing. And then it's important to note that the executive function, and we'll talk a little bit about brain development, that does not fully develop until mid to late 20s. There are some studies that are even showing early 30s, but executive function is the higher level decision making, cause and effect, consequence, setting goals, social behavior. So it doesn't mean that none of those are developing during a person's life, because we all know that kids at a very young age can begin to understand consequence. However, it's not fully developed until the mid to late 20s. If any of you were like me, I was making some major life decisions in my late teens and early 20s, and that I probably wouldn't make today, perhaps because of my lived experience, or perhaps because the way that I have developed in my brain development sees the world differently, and I process things differently now. So it's just some interesting facts about the youth or brain development. And it's important to know that because when we talk specifically about trauma, what we're saying here is when someone experiences a moment of trauma or a significant series of traumatic events in their life, it can affect the way that that person's brain develops. It affects the way that they see the world, and it can affect the way that they respond to the world. So we want to start there with saying there's a really kind of physiological, scientific thing behind this. So I'm going to go super simple here. This is a hand model of the brain. I'm going to talk just very basic, simple things about how the brain has been developed. And this is taken from Dr. Daniel Siegel's book, The Whole Brain Child. And I find that book to be a significantly wonderful resource for parents or for anybody working with kids, The Whole Brain Child. And then he also has another one called No Drama Discipline. And I love good drama, but not when it comes to parenting or doing things with kids. But he does a very simplistic hand model of the brain to understand how the brain develops, and then to understand what happens when we're at heightened levels. So I'm just going to go through this really quick. You hopefully all have a hand maybe that could do your own model of it. But our brain is connected to the rest of our body through the brainstem and the spinal cord. And the brainstem is the most basic level of bodily functions that controls things like swallowing, temperature regulation, letting your body know when you're hungry. And so that is just survival is the brainstem, just basic living survival things. And so that's kind of down here. And then when we come to the thumb, you see that it's when our fingers are totally up. The thumb that comes in is the limbic region, and the limbic regions control other survival things, but things that survive from the rest of the world around us. So things like our emotion, our behavior, long-term memory, motivation. So the limbic regions are, again, just basic human experiences that respond to the world around them, but it's typically done in an effort to keep us safe from the world around us. And I'll talk about that in a second, specifically with the amygdala. Then we have our 4 fingers that can come over the top of our thumb, and that we'll call the cerebral cortex. So that will be, if you come down with your thumb and on top and your fingers are pointing straight down, that's the next level of brain development. And the cortex does things like develops language, the self-perception, yourself existing in the world around you, consciousness, memory, short-term memories, how your memories connect together. And it also contributes to the central nervous system. So as your brain continues to develop throughout life, and particularly in your youth, that's why language is something that develops in time. That's why our self-perception, we look at kids that see themselves in the context of the rest of the world, that comes later on in development. And then the final thing that develops fully, it's continually developing, and this is extremely simplistic explanation of the brain, but the final thing is the prefrontal cortex, or the executive function. And that is what gives us the ability to understand cause and effect, planning for the future, setting goals, weighing consequences, and also social behaviors, social interactions. And so when we think about the fact that that's the final level that is fully developed as our brain is developing, if we experience trauma at any point during the development of our brain, it can do something called arrested development. So it kind of stops the brain from developing in certain ways, so that when we are in a heightened state of fear or trauma, we resort back to that basic existence. The amygdala, I like to call, is the alarm bell. I think of it as a sensitive smoke detector, only maybe because I have that in my own home. I have a very sensitive smoke detector. If our microwave is going too long, if I have an extra candle going, it's going off, and it is alerting me to dangers that aren't there. And that's what can happen sometimes with our kids that have experienced trauma, is their amygdala senses danger when there isn't really danger there. And what happens when the amygdala, or when the alarm bell goes off, we flip the lid. So our fingers go up because our limbic system is activated. And so when the limbic system takes over, that means that the rest of the brain function, if it's not fully developed, cannot overcome those basic survival moments. And that's really important to note. I don't know if anybody has worked with a child who made a choice and lost control, and now they're in a full tantrum, and we ask them to use their words. Well, they are being governed by their amygdala and limbic regions because their emotions have taken over and they have lost control. And we want them to use their words, which is from the cerebral cortex, and their brain is not in that. So we need to re-engage, which means a calming down, so that they can start to engage the rest of their brain. As we get older in life, I now, as a full-grown adult, can be in the midst of having an emotional moment. Maybe I've lost my temper because I'm disappointed with my daughter. And in the middle of me being very angry, perhaps I've even gone too far and I'm yelling at her, I can have the ability to stop myself in the midst of that and regain control, because my brain has developed fully and my executive function can kick in, whereas someone who is still developing, or perhaps has experienced some trauma or has some cognitive delays, they're not going to be able to do that in the same way because the limbic region will take over. And we want to thank the Lord for the limbic region, because when we are in danger, for example, if I am being chased by a bear, I will 10 times out of 10 be caught by that bear. And instead of me having to figure out how to keep myself safe, my body will immediately go into the survival mode. The limbic region will take over. My body will know how to regulate. It will send all of the blood to my core. It will have me go into the fetal position, protect certain parts that need to be protected. And I don't have to make a pros or cons list about it. I don't have to think about it, because the way God has created us is that part of our brain takes over to keep us safe. However, if we're not in a sense of danger, when we see kids that are responding in a way that isn't consistent with the environment around them, perhaps it's because their amygdala has been triggered because they sense danger. And a lot of times, not all the time, but a lot of times that can be a signal that perhaps they've experienced some kind of trauma. So I'm sure there is a lot of questions perhaps about the brain, but I don't want to spend a ton of time there because we got to get into the good stuff here to really understand, well, what does that mean when it comes to working with youth and families that have experienced trauma? So let's talk about and get on the same page about what trauma is. Trauma is an experience that involves a threat to life or safety, but really any situation that leaves someone feeling overwhelmed or isolated can result in trauma, even if it didn't involve physical harm. And I really emphasize the word can here, because just because one feels overwhelmed or isolated does not immediately mean that they have experienced trauma or that they will have a trauma response to that. However, every person is different. So we will see people that have experienced the same thing. Perhaps it's the pandemic. We've all gone through it. We maybe all had to shelter in place, but the effect that shelter in place had on people, for some, it was a traumatic effect that leaves residual damage or distress. And for others, it was difficult, but it's not necessarily a trauma that is going to lead to a re-triggering or a dangerous situation. So things that cause trauma, this is universally known, but typically it can be a one-time event. It can be chronic and ongoing stress, or it can be overlooked causes. So a one-time event, you would think a traumatic event is like a car accident. Chronic ongoing stress is something that is happening on a regular basis. So we'll think of families that maybe are going through something like homelessness. That's not always resulting in trauma for every person that is experiencing homelessness, but it can, and it often does. And that could be chronic and ongoing. And overlooked causes can be things like generational trauma or cultural trauma that has been passed down generation to generation. So someone may not have experienced that directly, but they are receiving the effects of that trauma. So who can be affected by trauma is really everyone. Anyone can experience or be affected, and everyone usually has a moment of trauma. The way their body and their mind responds to the traumatic event differs depending on the person. So trauma is something that is subjective. As I said before, the same situation doesn't mean the same results. It can affect an individual, it can affect an entire family, it can affect the culture or community, and it can be, as I said before, intergenerational or vicarious. So we talked a lot, we heard about that during the pandemic, and we're still experiencing that with our healthcare workers, our teachers, people who saw things and experienced things that maybe it wasn't their lived experience, but they were helping someone through something, and they have now vicarious trauma. And all of that is very real. Common elements of trauma are that the experience was unexpected. The person that was affected was unprepared. They didn't see it coming, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. And this is something that I think really kind of puts the value when we think of our kids. They have very little control in their world. And so we can see how something that perhaps is not as traumatic for an adult because they had some power and authority to stop it, or have some control in it, our kids are affected so much deeper because they are unprepared. They didn't know it was coming. I used earlier the example of homelessness. As a parent, I could maybe see that coming because I would be maybe aware of the series of events that led up to me losing my home. If I didn't, and nor should I necessarily share that with my child, it could be an even deeper effect on them. Again, I use that as an example that is not always the same for everyone, but that is the example that I used. So for children, the way that we define trauma, and I love simple definitions anyway, so I'll just use it because I think that it's good, is trauma is when something bad happens that makes you feel unsafe or scared. So we want to talk about being trauma-informed. So you hear the term trauma-informed care, being trauma-informed and giving the care because I understand what trauma is. It realizes that trauma is widespread. The impact can affect everyone and anyone. I am able to recognize signs and symptoms of trauma in others. If I am trauma-informed, I can respond, but by fully integrating the knowledge that I have, and not just responding on a one-to-one personal level in my practice, but influencing policies and procedures in my organization, in my church, in the community, in the culture that I'm a part of, and actively resisting re-traumatization. So I want to just be clear that trauma-informed care is not trauma treatment. I'm not a trauma treatment counselor. I can recognize signs and symptoms. I can navigate through behaviors that exhibit being re-traumatized or someone who is triggered from trauma, but I can't treat them the way that a licensed professional could. So if we are committed to being trauma-informed in our youth ministries, trauma-informed in the care that we give to our youth and families, that does not mean that we are the person that helps treat what they have gone through. We need to bring in or allow them to go to someone who has that specialty. But what we can do is create that positive condition for a person's recovery and growth. So when we talk, this is don't freak out. This is a yikes type of slide, but it is more of a visual than it is going step by step. But when we talk about being trauma informed, it's a shift of mindset. So I liked the visual of this because it gives the visual of the shift. And when we send out the resources with this video and we put it up on the YouTube, we'll link to this specific graphic so you can look at it more. But this is showing a shift from going from non-trauma informed to being a trauma-informed care professional or person. So it's the shift of, rather than saying, I'm helping you, and that always kind of looking at what they need help with, looking at what can they do to help themselves, how can I support them? It is kind of moving away from us and them, like I'm the solver and you're the problem, or you're presenting the problem, to more of let's work together and be collaboratory. Collaborative is not a word, but it could be, that'd be fun. It's really shifting away from, people are bad to people are doing the best that they know how to do. The big shift is rather than looking at what is wrong with you as a kid, looking to what has happened to you. So that's where we go to all behavior is communication. We all have experienced a child. We all have maybe been the child. Many of us have had our own children who could say that we look at what they're doing and their behavior is making us crazy. But the best way that we can handle that is to say, what are they trying to communicate through this behavior? Children, particularly those who have experienced trauma, may not be able to have the words or verbally describe what has happened or the problem that they're feeling. But at these times, they might act out. They might respond in a way that doesn't make sense. So if we can remember that all behavior is communication, when we're confronted with behavior that is difficult or challenging, we can reframe our thinking. We can shift like that arrow to going from what is wrong with you to what has happened to you. It's really a shift from changing our focus on what to why, not what you are doing, but why are you doing it? I give a common example. This was a big learning point for me in a classroom setting when I would flick the lights to get students' attention. And for me, I had an experience where I would flick the lights a little bit, and there was a class that would then have it would just break out into utter chaos. So rather than grabbing their attention and bringing them to a centered, focused point, it would erupt into chaos. And through trauma-informed care training, and what I realized is there were several students in the class that a flickering of the light was very triggering for them because of experiences that they had outside of the classroom. And so when that would go, that would set them off into an uncontrolled emotion, which then, if anybody's been in a classroom of second and third graders, if one kid starts screaming, then you've got a whole classroom of kids screaming. And so I had to shift how I navigated that class and the way that I communicated, bringing us to a calming center, because that method or that trick wasn't working. A lot of us will use our big voices to get people's attention. Kids will interpret that as yelling. And so perhaps if you're not getting the behavioral response that you want from the way that you're trying to navigate that room, maybe we could say, what do I need to change? How can I control this? And so that we are getting the expected results. And when a child's behavior is challenging or difficult, perhaps saying, what are they trying to tell me? What are they communicating to me? So again, I do really fast with the trauma, but I don't want to leave us doom and gloom with trauma. What do we do about it, and where do we go? And that's really a focus on resilience. It's not a solution. It doesn't solve the problem, but it certainly does help overcome or combat a traumatic experience, as if we have resilience. Resiliency is that ability of a child or person to recover and show that effective adaptation following a potentially traumatic event or an actual traumatic event. Some people just have the grit in them. Some people were just born more resilient. Others, we need to facilitate or develop that resilience in them. And I want to talk a little bit about what developing resilience in the life of our youth looks like, because we don't have the control to always stop the trauma that our kids and families are experiencing, but we can build into them and into our relationship with them a sense of resilience and hope so that they can perhaps combat that. And our hope is through Jesus Christ, overcome some of these traumatic experiences. I heard a great example recently about resilience is like a wire hanger. If you've ever bent a wire hanger, and then you can bend it back into a spot. It might not be exactly the way that it looked the first time, but you can get the general idea of what it looks like. But if I continue to bend that wire hanger in the same spot, while I can get it to bounce back into its shape, eventually through consistent bending and pressure, that wire hanger will break. So resilience is a tool that we use that we can build into our kids, but it's not the ultimate solution. The ultimate solution, especially with those experiencing chronic trauma, is the elimination of the traumatic event if possible. And sometimes that's not in our control. So let's talk about how we build resilience. The first one is creating an attitude of a growth mindset, and it starts with you, and it starts with your attitude in your groups with your kids, but it also looks at the activities that we want our kids to do. So sometimes, because we know that we have kids that have had some more trauma in their lives or are more difficult to navigate through challenging behaviors, we have a fixed mindset about what they can do. And so we avoid challenges, or we give up early, or we think that their talents or their skills are kind of set. This is as far as we're going to go, and we just stay here. But a growth mindset embraces those challenges. It looks to persevere through failures, that we can develop our talents and abilities. We find inspiration in others' success rather than being threatened by others' success. And we look for people who will challenge us to grow, rather than looking for people that will always just say, you're the best at everything that you do. So when you think about your ministry in the context of what you do in your core or in your community, are you a person that is promoting a growth mindset, or do you have a fixed mindset about your kids and about yourself? And I have to say, if I'm speaking super honestly, I am challenged by a growth mindset. I make a joke all the time that I love playing games, but I usually don't engage in playing games that I know I can't win, which is not a growth mindset. And so I really have to challenge myself to just try something new. Be willing to fail. Have you created an environment that it's safe to fail in? That kids will not feel like their whole self-worth has fallen apart if they tried something and it didn't work. So that's one of the first steps that we can do in building resilience and cultivating resilience, is to develop a growth mindset in ourselves and in the way that we build our programming. And then really, relationships are key. You might be sitting wherever you are watching this saying, I already knew that relationships are key. But more recently, I would like to point out that we have some research done by the Search Institute, and they researched, and through theirs, they do surveys, and they surveyed over 25,000 students, and have, through that research process that happened about 7 years ago, they have determined that developmental relationships are key in establishing resilience and cultivating what we need to overcome the difficult things in life. You'll hear a lot of different ways to cultivate resilience. There are the 5 pillars of resilience, the 7 C's of resilience. In the Salvation Army, we do the 40 developmental assets. Those assets are ways that we cultivate resilience, but it needs to be done within the framework of a developmental relationship. Research shows that maintaining at least one stable, healthy relationship with an encouraging adult is one of the most important factors for developing resilience and overcoming adversity. The 40 developmental assets encourages us to have our kids have 3 important adult relationships beyond their parents. But if we can just have one stable, healthy relationship with an encouraging adult, and that's important. And I want to point out that relationships are reciprocal. So this is not us going into the life of a youth and it being one-sided. If we want to get to know them, we need to allow them to get to know us, and building that relationship with them is so important. So it is important to separate the behavior from the child's identity, right? It's not what they do, but we want to focus on the fact that who they are is a child of God. They're made in the image of God. And while their behavior might be difficult, or it might be hard to decipher what they're trying to communicate, or they might have gone through extreme trauma, through relationship, perhaps we could identify who they are, what gives their spark, and how we can come alongside them on their journey. So just a couple more slides here. This is also from the Search Institute reporting those developmental relationships. So we can say really positive here that 28% of youth said that they had 4 to 5 strong relationships. That's amazing. And then we can look and say 31% had 2 to 3 strong relationships, and even 18%. So the majority of kids reported having at least one strong relationship, right? But 22% said they had none. That's 1 in 5 children. 1 in 5 children reported that they had no strong developmental relationship. If we go back to what I said before, we need at least 1, right? 3 is best, but none. 1 in 5 kids. How can we make a difference? So what is a developmental relationship? The developmental relationships that build resilience have 5 tenets or 5 elements. They express care, they challenge growth, they provide support, they share power, and they expand possibilities. So I encourage you, as you think about your ministry and your role in the life of your kids, we don't have the chance to always stop the trauma that has happened to them. However, we can build resilience and cultivate that in their life by investing in a relationship and showing them that they matter. pushing them to keep getting better, growth mindset, right? Providing support, helping them to complete tasks and achieve goals, sharing power by treating them with respect, giving them a say, looking at our youth as the resource to give us the information and the leadership that we need, and expand possibilities, connecting them to people and places that can broaden their world and that can give them experiences. I'm reminded every time that I talk about trauma-informed care, I'm going to wrap it up here and then we'll open it up to questions for that conversation. But when I think about relationships, it is intentional kindness and love, the loving kindness that is truly there. And I think of the verses from Titus chapter 3, where it says, but when God, our Savior, revealed his kindness and his love, when he invested in a relationship, he saved us not because of the righteous things that we had done, but because of his mercy. He washed away our sins, giving us a new birth and a new life through the Holy Spirit. And he generously poured out his Spirit upon us through Jesus Christ, our Savior. His kindness and his love did all of these things. We need to work within any context that we are, whether it be within the church or whether it be within secular community organizations that we're a part of or work. We can build resilience, we can do that, but if we can have the hope of Jesus Christ, the example of his loving kindness, then I truly believe that we will be able to be a part of transformative work in the life of our kids and our youth. So again, I hope you enjoyed your lunch in Paris. You definitely need to take some time to get to know more of it, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and we'll open that up to some questions that we have about trauma-informed care or building resilience.
Perfect. Yes. So go right ahead and put any questions you have for Peggy in the Q&A chat, and we'll go ahead and address those live here with you. But I'd like to just start off with a question while people type in their questions. Are there any additional trainings or resources on trauma-informed care or the 40 developmental assets that are accessible?
Yeah. So if you are interested in doing 40 developmental assets and and the developmental relationship framework, that can be done directly through Search Institute. And sometimes we have some trainings within our divisions that do it, but if you wanted to be certified, Search Institute is the way to go. And they typically you do have to pay for them. And I would, when it comes to trauma-informed care, there are community organizations that offer that. I think one of our best resources within the Salvation Army is connect with your Pathway of Hope or your social service department. I am sure that they have some either internal trainings or they require their staff to attend to those trainings as well. Things that participate in mindfulness training, trauma-informed care, and even vicarious trauma or self-care, because we might not be necessarily healthcare frontline workers, but you too are serving families and youth that have experienced significant traumatic events. And we can have that vicarious trauma even in the line of youth ministry. So finding those resources, I think every community's resources look a little bit different. And so that's why I said to connect with, if you have Pathway of Hope, a social services director, your divisional social services director would be a great start within the context of the Salvation Army.
Awesome, thank you. So in the Salvation Army, we have a lot of mandated programming, or what people sometimes term fixed programming. What does it look like to lead youth into a growth mindset within a fixed programming setting?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? So I think we need to participate in a shift again. So when we talk about trauma-informed care, it's all about the shift. And so if we can shift from focusing on the 1, 2, 3s of the lesson. So in order for us to achieve this lesson, we have to go 1, 2, 3, and then they can get the emblem, or then they can finish this lesson, or we feel accomplished. If we can look at yes, we have that framework, but what are our goals with our kids? And I like to look at goals and outcomes different. So my outcome is what I want to accomplish in that class. I want them to learn how water turns to ice and ice melts because we're doing a science lesson. That's my outcome. But if my goal is that I want every kid that comes into my building to feel safe, to know that they are loved by me and to know that they are loved by Jesus Christ, then if I'm not accomplishing my outcome because perhaps we got derailed from an outside situation that happened in our community, then I can focus in on building the relationship and that growth mindset there. The other thing that I would say of building growth mindsets is don't sell your kids short. Don't say they're never going to be able to do this. So maybe we need to bring in more leaders, more volunteers, or maybe we need to teach it a little bit different. Or maybe we just can try something and it can be a disaster. Like I give the example that I have tried to teach needlepoint or even like crochet in person was a disaster. I tried to do needlepoint on Zoom and that was terrible. But I don't want to discount it, right? Let's just try it. And then we say together collectively, we try and we do hard things. The last thing that I will say to that is challenge yourself to do things that you're not good at, right? So I'm terrible at basketball, like really, really bad. I love the sport. I'll sit on the sidelines. I know all the rules, but I can't shoot a basket to save my life. But maybe I just need to show that I'm willing to participate in the game to show what a growth mindset looks like.
That's a great answer. Thank you. Thank you for that insight. Another question we have for you is how can you handle or address trauma-induced behavior in a classroom setting?
Yeah, super good. And so hard, right? Because it's individual, person by person looks different. So I think the first thing before we even talk about unpacking anything of what to do is you have to make sure that you aren't predetermining that you're going to be annoyed before that kid even comes in the classroom. Right? And that's really hard to do, especially if they consistently unhinge the lesson or the program every time they come in because of their behavior. It can be really hard to not just automatically put them in that box and exclude them from the group. So I think that that's really, we really need to start there and saying like, okay, we know this is happening. But what we want to do is we need to look at what they're trying to communicate. So if we have a kid that their behavior is aggressively derailing through acting out loudly, okay? So they are taking over, they're maybe speaking out, they're maybe really funny, kids are listening to them and not listening to you. What are they trying to communicate? Are they trying to have attention? Are they doing attention-seeking behavior because of what, right? Is it because they feel safe when they're in control? And so can we give them some activities that feel that they are in control of in something in that class? When they first walk in, you already have handouts that they need to be giving out to the kids. This is your job to do. So it's not a one size fits all because we have to determine what they're trying to communicate. Are they acting out in a behavior that because they feel safest when they have control? Then what can I build into my lesson that gives them control? Are they acting out by withdrawing? Are they not participating? Which if I get one wallflower, then I've got 15 wallflowers, because if you've got one kid that sees they don't have to participate, I've got 15 that say they don't have to participate. So do I have a wallflower kid, and is it because they don't feel safe in taking a risk or trying new things? And so how do I address that? If the safest thing for them to do is sit on the wall, then I need to address the other kids and say, you know what, we live in a world that we give everybody what they need, and what Joey needs right now is to sit here, but that's not what you need. We need you to participate in this activity. So we have to identify what the behavior is, not just what they're doing, but why are they doing it? What are they trying to tell me in this situation? Again, we are not trauma counselors. There is some trauma and behaviors because of that trauma that are so significant that other kids are now, their safety is in danger. And we really have to look at if our safety or another kid's safety is in danger, that goes beyond just something I can handle in the classroom. So I think that's really important to look at. The last thing I would say is you don't want to match. You don't want to match their level on a high end or on a low end, right? We're the adults with the fully formed brain that's developed. So if we have someone that's escalated, what happens when we match their level? They're going to escalate here. And so if we can keep ourselves regulated, if we can keep ourselves in a point to show you are safe here, you are loved, even though this is where you're at, and we can bring them back down here, And don't expect them to have words to their behavior if they're at an escalated state. So if they came in escalated because riding in a van is very scary for them for whatever reason, we might need to give them 5 or 6 minutes to de-escalate so that they can put words to how they're feeling. A lot of times we trigger or escalate kids more because we're demanding them to explain things that they don't have words for. I love the example of teenagers when we say to them, what were you thinking? You know, we've all been with teenagers. We've all maybe been the teenager that did something that was just so dumb. And now we've got the back window of our van that's busted out because they just were being silly. And we want to, and what we say is, what were you thinking? And they go, So I'm here to tell you, they actually don't know what they were thinking. Like scientifically, they don't know. We need to give space. And typically, not in all cases, but typically a lot of times after they're given space to kind of bring their brain back down from a heightened level, they have a lot of regret. They still can't tell you what they were thinking because they don't know. They weren't engaged in that part of their brain, but they have a lot of regret there. So those are just some examples, but I go back to all behavior is communication. And so if you have the resources at your court, and I know not all of us do, and so this is pie in the sky, but if you have the resources to bring in another adult or someone who can help assess what are they trying to communicate so that child is given what they need so that you can continue to do what's happening in the class, that is very helpful as well.
Great. And one more question for you today, Peggy. So you have a background in education. So you love all of that, that realm of things. You are fantastic with, working with children and kind of understanding developmentally where they stand and all of these things. So how do you maybe manage or work to moving forward in a relationship with a youth or a child who is not desiring to communicate or to participate or even form a relationship with you to make that happen in a program setting or even in a classroom setting? How would you address that?
Yeah. So the first thing that I can say is consistency, right? Don't give up. So when I say a relationship is reciprocal, I mean that, but it doesn't start reciprocal all the time. So a lot of times when we have a kid, particularly a child that is resisting engaging in any kind of relationship, they're testing the waters. Are you going to be one more person that is just going to give up on them? So they'll give up first, right? So how do we consistently show up? If I say, I love you, you belong here, I need you here, and then I give up on them on week 3 because they weren't actually reciprocating that, then I need to put myself as the adult in check, right? Because I love and need the relationships of the kids that I serve, but they're not my best friends. They're not the ones that I go to when I need support or having a bad day, right? I need to have my own support system so that I am not undone when they hate me, when I am the worst, when they don't reciprocate that. So we have to start with consistency. And I truly believe that. The other thing is we need to check our biases. Are we always sure that we know how another person communicates? So I am, you can read everything I feel on my face. I use my words to communicate things. I typically have just a resting happy face that people think I'm always in, like I can just be happy and I'm just sitting in a store or doing something. And so I have that naturally. And then God blessed me with a daughter that doesn't have any of that. She does not have that kind of warm personality where everyone's drawn to. So I can't assume that just because she's responding in a way that looks like she's miserable, that she's actually miserable, because that's not the same. That's how I look when I'm miserable. That's not how she looks. So we need to check to make sure that what our child or what we think the children are communicating is actually what they're communicating, right? Also remember that kids don't have the vocabulary all the time. So they can say things like, I hate this place. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they hate this place. It means I'm having a bad day, I don't want to be here, or I'm bored, or I don't feel safe. But hate is the only word that they have, right? And so let's, try to see through that consistent relationship and consistently showing up in the life of that child, can we navigate to see if we can get to a point where they can start to communicate what they're actually feeling and needing. I truly believe that there is no child that is beyond help. It just means some child needs different help. And I might not be the person that is the expert in that area. So I might need somebody else to come in and help me with that. And I will just kind of put that plug out there, is that it feels very lonely in our core and on the field. We can feel isolated and alone and overwhelmed. You have a resource of other leaders. There are people in this podcast. There are people in this webinar right now that are also experiencing leadership. You have divisional youth leaders. You have other cores in your community, and you have us here teach you. Like, let's use our resources together to build each other up, to go through a specific scenario and say, this is where I'm struggling. Let's try this. What about this? Have you tried this? Let's use one another, because we are truly, that's where we're at, the family of God. That's where we're at our best, is when we can do that with one another.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Peggy, for sharing your knowledge and your insight and wisdom for us. This is such a crucial topic for us to really be effective in youth ministry and create those long-lasting relationships, and be people that don't give up. You know, I love when you said it's important to separate the behavior from a child's identity. What they do is not who they are. So let's make those relationships and be intentional, and keep to it, and be intentional, and just keep going with what we need to do. So thank you so much, Peggy, for joining us today. And thank you all for tuning in today to our Spotlight webinar. Our next webinar will be Wednesday, May 11th at 12 p.m. Registration information will be sent later this week. May God bless you as you continue to serve and build his kingdom. We're praying for you.